Who gon' take it there? 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 Electricity, 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 electricity. You know what's in the air. 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 It's possibility. It's possibility. It's possibility. It's possibility.
All right, so I want to talk about this thing with Jimmy Kimmel. Jimmy Kimmel's show has been pulled off the air by ABC because of threats made by Donald Trump's FCC commissioner on Benny Johnson's podcast. So we are in an era right now where podcasters are dominating the political conversation in so many ways. You go from the influence that Joe Rogan has and how much we're constantly talking about that and that dynamic politically, and you have Charlie Kirk's death absolutely dominating the news cycle in this country, and becoming probably one of the most important stories of at least this leg of Trump's administration. And you have these podcasts, specifically the right-wing podcasts that have been set up by people like Charlie Kirk, Benny Johnson, and other sort of right-wing ops. Dan Bongino was a podcaster before he was hired in the FBI. I think Kash Patel was too, but not as much. Dan Bongino had a very popular program. And so these are the outlets that these people have created are now the platforms through which the state is laundering its ideology and its propaganda. And that was always the case, but it's more explicit now than ever. J.D. Vance took over for an episode of Charlie Kirk's podcast, used it to bring Stephen Miller on and talk about this draconian crackdown that they want to do on the left. So the apparatus that has been built over the last several years, partially with some Russian money, partially with some shady billionaire money in America from people like the Kochs and the Mercers, this apparatus of alternative right-wing media has turned into the mainstream. And Benny Johnson is a particularly interesting example of that because he's another one of these guys that kind of seems to have come up out of nowhere and become more relevant than like his audience would reflect. The reason we're talking about Joe Rogan all the time is because his audience is so enormous that the impact is palpable, and most of it's organic, if not all of it. Joe Rogan is not really somebody that you could accuse of being astroturfed, maybe at this point. But Benny Johnson, Dan Bongino, these are guys who appear out of nowhere, and it seems like it's probably because they're floated by a certain amount of money. This is the Ben Shapiro model of climbing to the top of the media ladder, is you just get enough funding and you dump enough money into the project to float ads to the top of the algorithm. And if you can sustain that for long enough, eventually you will become a mainstream recognized force, as well as being able to provoke reactions from your enemies and that sort of thing. But what I've noticed about Benny Johnson is that he seems to pop up at very opportune moments. And he is somebody in the right-wing sphere that actually takes swings at trying to like really influence the discourse, more so than just saying some shocking thing or trying to stoke anger or fear around a certain video clip or something like that. What Johnson does is he will, put on the alligator Alcatraz merchandise and sort of grift off that. Or a lot of people didn't catch that when Trump was asked about Zohran Mamdani and he said about how he's a communist, this guy's a straight up communist and we can't have this, we've got to do something. This was a few months ago, I think right after he had won the primary. That question was asked by Benny Johnson, and Benny Johnson framed it in such a way that I believe in the question, he referred to Zohran Mamdani as a communist and then pitched Donald Trump that. And that's one of the leading questions that Trump gets a lot nowadays. And oftentimes, especially if it's coming from a right-wing perspective, he'll just kind of bounce off of that and roll with it. And now you have this interview with Benny Johnson and the FCC chair, where the FCC chair takes the opportunity to threaten ABC over the comments that Jimmy Kimmel made about Charlie Kirk. Listen, pretty moderate stuff here, but this is exactly the kind of commentary that right-wingers have been screaming that they have the right to make and that they're being censored because of pushback. And this is not pushback. This is a government official getting on the air to threaten a private company to say, we might have to do something about it unless you do something about it. So straight up mafia tactics, definitely a violation of the First Amendment. Probably just straightforwardly a legal violation of the First Amendment that will not hold up in court. But the ABC seems to have immediately caved and got rid of Jimmy Kimmel. So what I want to do real quick is just play what Kimmel said, as well as this interview, just a clip from this interview that Benny Johnson did with this FCC chair, just so you can see what we're talking about. And then I'll get a little bit more into the details of why Kimmel is being fired and how exactly that works, as well as some of the details of who Benny Johnson is and how bizarre it is that he finds himself in this particular position. So let's watch these clips real quick.
We hit some new lows over the weekend with the MAGA gang desperately trying to characterize this kid who murdered Charlie Kirk as anything other than one of them, and doing everything they can to score political points from it. In between the finger pointing, there was grieving. On Friday, the White House flew the flags at half staff, which got some criticism. But on a human level, you can see how hard the president is taking this.
My condolences on the loss of your friend Charlie Kirk. May I ask, sir, personally, how are you holding up over the last day and a half, sir?
I think very good. And by the way, right there, you see all the trucks? They've just started construction of the new ballroom for the White House, which is something they've been trying to get, as you know, for about 150 years. And it's going to be a beauty.
Yes. He's at the fourth stage of grief, construction. Demolition, construction. This is not how an adult grieves the murder of someone he called a friend. This is how a 4-year-old mourns a goldfish.
There's actions that we can take on licensed broadcasters, and frankly, I think that it's really sort of past time that a lot of these licensed broadcasters themselves push back on Comcast and Disney and say, listen, we are going to preempt, we are not going to run Kimmel anymore until you straighten this out, because we licensed broadcaster are running the possibility of fines or license revocations from the FCC if we continue to run content that ends up being a pattern of news distortion. So I think, again, Disney needs to see some change here, but the individual licensed stations that are taking their content, it's time for them to step up and say, this, garbage, to the extent that that's what comes down the pipe in the future, isn't something that we think serves the needs of our local communities. But this sort of status quo is obviously not acceptable.
Pretty banal stuff from Kimmel here. Definitely worse things are being said on Fox News and Newsmax on a daily basis, which, not for nothing, Benny Johnson actually formerly worked at Newsmax. And he's had a lot of jobs over the years that fell apart because he is a plagiarizer, a serial plagiarizer. Many instances of him plagiarizing, lost the job at BuzzFeed over that, as well as losing a job at a different outlet because of his toxic and sort of tyrannical behavior. I believe he was in a position of leadership at that job and was fired for creating a toxic workplace. He's worked at The Blaze, he's worked at Newsmax. He was also one of the creators who was caught up in this Tenet Media thing, which was essentially a Russian-backed company that paid American influencers like Benny Johnson and Tim Pool to push certain narratives that would stoke division in America. And a lot of people, that story at the time got turned into very pro-Russian propaganda. They're pushing Russian propaganda, but it's really more about this angle that has been brushed over at this point because of what a failure of the media to properly communicate Trump's connections to Russia and why it matters. And turning it into this enormous scandal that it did not live up to, rather than focusing on the real danger of it. And so it's really just become normal in politics that there are certain entities that are propped up by Russia, not to just push anti-Ukraine narratives and stuff like that, although that's a part of it, but really to push narratives that divide America more. And that's the consistent thread here, more so than they were paying influencers to prop up Russia and denigrate Ukraine, although again, that is part of what they did. And one of the few things on record that was asked of one of the Tenet Media influencers specifically to cover was an attack in Moscow that was blamed on Ukraine, even though ISIS took responsibility for the attack. And Tim Pool was happy to take the suggestion to cover that. So they were directly suggesting some stories to these creators. And in some cases, they were willing to do that. But more so, what they were talking about was racism and free speech and black people and white people. These were the type of phrases that were coming up in the videos that Tenet Media paid for. And coincidentally, the founder of that company, Lauren Chen, was also an employee of Turning Point USA, as was Benny Johnson, formerly. So, the connections are all there. All of these organizations are tied in with each other, and Tenet Media was selected, either it was propped up or founded for the purposes of spreading this propaganda, not because it was spreading a pro-Russian narrative, but because it was spreading the types of divisive narratives that Russia feels it benefits from. And so that increasingly has become what Benny Johnson traffics in. It's what his job is, essentially, is to find ways to stoke division in American politics, media, and culture. And because he has been propped up to this sort of pretty high-level position in politics and association with the administration, I mean, he gets this interview, this insane news-breaking interview with this FCC commissioner who felt that his platform was the right place to issue these threats. Now, the dynamic behind Kimmel actually getting fired goes like this. There's two companies, the most important one being Nexstar. There's also a company called Sinclair that essentially own the local broadcasting stations throughout the nation. And so what happened after the FCC issued this threat was those companies said they were going to pull Jimmy Kimmel off the air. So not ABC, but because those companies that actually air the programming throughout the country said that they were going to pull it, and I think they said they were going to replace that time slot with something else, I don't know, pro Charlie Kirk propaganda or some shit. That put enough pressure on ABC that they quickly decided to fire Kimmel. So this problem with Sinclair Broadcasting and other companies like Nexstar has been bubbling for a while, where they've been buying up more and more of the local broadcasting stations throughout the country, and they have a very specific right-wing slant, and you're seeing that manifest now. Nexstar also is attempting a merger with another company called Tegna. I don't know where these companies or these names are coming from. I've never heard of this one, Tegna, but essentially that's another one of these mergers that needs to go through the Trump administration, and if and when that merger goes through, they're going to control 80% of the local broadcasting stations in America. So this is not only those companies applying pressure on ABC, trying to acquiesce to the Trump administration, aside from the fact that they are already aligned with what the Trump administration wants, but this is also a consolidation of power. These mergers would be bad enough, except for the fact that this is essentially an arm of the Trump administration, and by sending these mergers through the Trump administration, through this FCC commissioner that went on Benny Johnson's program to air this out, they're essentially agreeing to a large conglomerate that is aligned with this pro-Trump, pro-Charlie Kirk media agenda. So they are using the Charlie Kirk thing not only to engage in this censorship, but also to set the stage for an enormous media merger that is going to dominate the majority of cable news. And then there's questions to be had about what happens to the independent media space, what happens to other entities like Act Blue. I believe that the feds have been trying to figure out a case that they can bring against Act Blue, which is the main fundraising apparatus for not only the Democratic Party, but also the Democratic Socialists and other entities aligned with that. So we're seeing right now what it looks like for the Trump administration to go after the media in the way that it's been threatening to for a long time. It also should be noted that ABC did not have to bend to this. They could have fought this. And like I said, this threat issued by the FCC commissioner on air is almost certainly just straight up illegal. So they could have definitely fought this in court, and in some way it'll probably get reversed at some point. It seems to me like Jimmy Kimmel has a hell of a lawsuit that he can bring up if he wants to. But we're seeing now that these type of threats, and especially, aligned with a coordinated effort from these organizations and companies that are already tied in with the Trump administration, they can exert an enormous amount of pressure on these companies. So that brings into question a company like Twitch or YouTube. which are connected to the larger conglomerates Google and Amazon. Trump has not set his sights on those entities yet, but Elon Musk is making noise about Hassan Piker and Destiny and others. And so it's probably not long before they direct their attention that way. And so what that means is that it's time for us to start thinking seriously about what it would look like to move some of these online communities to different platforms. If Hassan gets banned off of Twitch, he's gonna have to go somewhere else. He's gonna have to go to Rumble, he's gonna have to go to Kick or one of these other creepy platforms that all the right-wing creeps that we were happy to see go have fled to. But the reality is those people, whether it's Sneeko or Nick Fuentes or Aiden Ross or plenty of others, they've built large platforms in these other places. So the repression that comes down on the left is going to be more draconian than anything that has happened on the right, which again, that could lead to legal troubles. This could even lead to the Supreme Court ruling against the Trump administration, which is not as likely as we'd like it to be. But I mean, this stuff is pretty straightforward. Pretty straightforward violation of people's First Amendment rights happening here. This is exactly what the government is not allowed to do. The First Amendment is not about companies allowing you to say whatever you want on their platform. But as soon as the government is leaning on a company, trying to fire somebody because of what they said, I mean, that's a straight up violation of the First Amendment. But that doesn't mean that they're not going to start leaning on platforms like YouTube and Twitch. And what that's going to do is both cause a little bit of dispersal in those audiences, but it's also going to force the communities underground. And so we have to be ready for that. We have to imagine what that looks like, and we have to prepare the resources to make sure that we can stay connected with different content creators and different organizations that we want to stay connected with if they get forced underground. So it's time to start thinking about that. People have been talking to me about starting a Discord, which isn't my favorite platform, but it's definitely a place to start. You know, Telegram channels. It's very, very possible that in the near future, platforms like that are going to be essential to the survival of these communities that we have been able to build on platforms like YouTube and Twitch. So hopefully this blows over. You know, somebody like me is probably under the radar enough for now, but this could result in sweeping policy changes at YouTube or Twitch. Who knows what could happen from here. And even if this leads to some kind of protracted fight in the courts about what's legal and what's not, the idea, like just in the case of Jimmy Kimmel, doesn't really matter what ends up happening in court because his ass got fired anyway. And it's similar to the case with Stephen Colbert, where it's really just about his contract being up. I think they're pulling him off the air immediately, but his contract was set to expire anyway. But still, even the Alex Joneses, under all the pressure that he's been under, the court cases he's lost, and the fact that he was fully deplatformed everywhere on the internet, he's continued growing his audience. I don't even know what the metrics are on that. But the cultural influence of Alex Jones, Nick Fuentes, and other monsters like them has not gone away. And unfortunately, we're going to have to start looking at that model in order to preserve this movement past the Trump administration. Because just allowing these communities to disperse and have nowhere to go is not an option. We have to start preparing the channels that people can regather and regroup in if this draconian crackdown on free speech continues, which it is likely to.